Welcome, wherever you are in the world tonight. Settle in, get comfortable, and let yourself drift into the quiet and fascinating corners of Canadian history. A story so rich, so strange, and so full of wonder that even the most dedicated history teacher could never fit it all into one class. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. Fact 1. The land before the maps. Long before any European cartographer ever attempted to sketch the coastlines of the continent now known as Canada, the land was home to an astonishing diversity of human civilizations, each one as complex and vibrant as any society that existed anywhere on Earth at the time. Archaeologists and historians now estimate that indigenous peoples had been living across what we call Canada for somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years before European contact, meaning their history on this land stretches back so far into time that it dwarfs the entire recorded history of ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt, and China combined. These were not simply wandering bands of hunters, as they were so often portrayed in the simplistic school textbooks of the past. They were farmers, traders, diplomats, astronomers, architects, and storytellers who built entire worlds out of the landscape around them. Fact 2. The Viking settlement. Nobody talked about. Here is something that most people who grew up learning about Christopher Columbus and the year 1492 were almost certainly never told in school. Nearly 500 years before Columbus ever set sail from Spain, Norse Vikings had already established a permanent settlement on the northeastern tip of what is now the island of Newfoundland in Canada. The site, known today as L'Anse aux Meadows, sits on a windswept promontory overlooking the Strait of Belle Isle, and it was discovered by Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Steen Ingstad in 1960 after a local fisherman quietly pointed them towards some unusual grassy mounds. What they uncovered beneath those mounds was extraordinary. The preserved remains of a Norse village complete with longhouses, a forge, and artifacts that matched almost perfectly the descriptions found in ancient Viking sagas. The site dates to around the year 1000 CE, and it represents the earliest known European presence in the Americas. Full stop. Fact 3. The river that refused to be named once. The Street. Lawrence River, that vast and powerful waterway that stretches from the Great Lakes all the way out to the Atlantic Ocean, is one of the most historically important bodies of water in all of North America, and yet the name it carries today was essentially an accident of timing. When French explorer Jacques Cartier sailed into its mouth on August 10th, 1535, he happened to arrive on the feast day of St. Lawrence of Rome, a 3rd century Christian martyr who, according to historical legend, was executed by being roasted alive on a gridiron, and who reportedly told his executioners partway through the process that they could turn him over because he was done on one side. Cartier, being a pious Catholic sailor in an era when naming geographic features after saints was standard practice, simply called the Gulf and the river after the saint, whose feast day had coincided with his arrival. Before that moment, the indigenous peoples of the region had their own rich names for this waterway, and it had been known to earlier European fishermen by various other terms. Fact 4. The chief who predicted the future of nations. Somewhere in the misty history of the northeastern woodlands, probably sometime in the 12th or 13th century, a man of extraordinary vision and political genius began to travel from village to village, carrying a message of peace. His name was Deganawida, and he is known in Haudenosaunee history as the Peacemaker, a figure so revered that in many traditional communities his personal name is considered too sacred to speak aloud, which is why he is referred to by his title instead. Deganawida, together with his companion and interpreter Hiawatha, worked tirelessly to convince the 5 warring nations of the northeastern woodlands, the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Oneida, and the Seneca, to lay down their weapons and unite under a shared constitution called the Great Law of Peace. What emerged was the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, a league of nations governed by a Grand Council, with elaborate systems for debate, consensus building, checks on power, and the rights of women to remove leaders who failed their people. Fact 5. The map that lied about everything. In the early years of European exploration of Canada, the maps being produced in Paris, London, Lisbon, and Amsterdam were works of breathtaking creative fiction as much as they were works of geography. Cartographers working from the fragmentary and often wildly inaccurate accounts of sailors and explorers would fill in the vast blank spaces of the continent with their best guesses, their wishful thinking, and sometimes their outright imagination. For much of the 16th and 17th centuries, maps of what is now Canada depicted a mythical inland sea called the Sea of the West, a body of water that supposedly stretched across the interior of the continent and offered a navigable route through to the Pacific Ocean and the riches of Asia beyond. Explorers were funded and sent out specifically to find this sea, and many of them, rather than admit failure and return empty-handed to their royal patrons, produced reports that confirmed the sea's existence, adding new fictional details to keep the myth alive. Fact 6. The feast that built an empire. Few things shaped the early history of Canada more profoundly than an animal that most people today associate with wildlife documentaries and luxury hat shops, the North American beaver. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the fashionable courts of Europe had developed an insatiable appetite for felt, hats made from beaver fur, a material that was uniquely suited to the felting process and produced a smooth, water-resistant hat of extraordinary quality. European beaver populations had been hunted nearly to extinction trying to meet this demand, but the forests of Canada held millions of beavers, and the indigenous peoples who had been trapping and trading furs for generations were perfectly positioned to become the primary suppliers of what was essentially the oil of its era. The fur trade that developed around this demand drew European powers deep into the Canadian interior, established trading relationships and alliances that shaped the political landscape of the continent, and ultimately became the economic engine that funded the colonial project in Canada for nearly 2 centuries. Entire cities were founded as fur trading posts. Fact 7. The woman who saved a colony. The early history of European settlement in Canada is full of stories of men, explorers and soldiers, and governors whose names fill the history books. But one of the most remarkable figures of the entire colonial era was a woman whose story is rarely told with the prominence it deserves. Marie de l'Incarnation arrived in New France in 1639 at the age of 40, a French Ursuline nun who had left behind her grown son and her comfortable life in Tours to cross the Atlantic and establish a school for indigenous girls in the raw and dangerous settlement of Quebec. What she accomplished in the decades that followed was extraordinary. She learned not one but several indigenous languages, becoming one of the most accomplished linguistic scholars in the colony, and she produced dictionaries and catechisms in Algonquin and Iroquoian that remain valuable historical documents today. When the Ursuline convent burned to the ground in 1650, she oversaw its rebuilding from scratch. When conflict threatened the colony's survival, she wrote thousands of letters back to France, arguing for support and reinforcement. Fact 8. The war that nobody wanted to win. In the summer of 1812, the United States declared war on Britain and immediately set about attempting to invade and conquer Canada, which at the time was a collection of British colonies with a scattered population of perhaps 500,000 people facing an American nation of roughly 7 million. On paper, the outcome seemed obvious. American politicians spoke openly about the conquest of Canada being a mere matter of marching, suggesting that the population of the colonies would welcome liberation and that the whole affair would be wrapped up in weeks. What actually happened was one of the most complicated and fascinating military and political disasters in American history. The invasion attempts failed repeatedly, often spectacularly, defeated not just by British regulars and Canadian militia, but by indigenous warriors under leaders like Tecumseh, whose military genius and strategic alliances proved decisive in the early phases of the conflict. Fact 9. The ice road to nowhere. There is a place in the Northwest Territories of Canada where for a few precious weeks, each winter when the temperatures drop low enough and the ice grows thick enough, trucks loaded with supplies make a journey across frozen lakes and rivers to reach communities that have no other road connection to the outside world. The Mackenzie Winter Road is one of the most challenging and celebrated driving routes in the world, stretching hundreds of kilometers across ice that is sometimes only barely thick enough to support the weight of a fully loaded transport truck. Drivers on this road must follow strict speed limits to avoid creating resonance waves in the ice that can crack the surface ahead of them. They must listen for the deep groaning sounds that signal dangerous weak spots. They sometimes drive with their doors unlatched so that they can jump free if their vehicle begins to break through. The communities these roads serve, places like Wrigley and Tulita and Fort Good Hope, depend entirely on the winter road season to receive the heavy goods, fuel, and equipment that sustain them for the rest of the year. Fact 10. The inventor hidden in history. In the long and distinguished history of Canadian invention, few figures are as quietly important or as consistently overlooked as Reginald Fessenden, a man born in the small Quebec village of East Bolton in 1866, who would go on to change the way human beings communicate with one another. While Guglielmo Marconi was winning Nobel Prizes and international fame for his work on wireless telegraphy, essentially using radio waves to send Morse code, Fessenden was working on something far more ambitious and far more consequential. On Christmas Eve of 1906, from a transmitter station he had built at Brant Rock in Massachusetts, Fessenden became the first person in history to broadcast a human voice over radio waves. Ships at sea with wireless receivers that night heard something unprecedented, a man's voice coming out of the static, reading from the Bible, playing a violin, and wishing his listeners a Merry Christmas. It was the moment that radio, as we know it, was born, the beginning of broadcast culture, of news and music and storytelling sent through the air to anyone with a receiver. Fact 11. The forgotten pandemic of 1918. When the influenza pandemic of 1918 swept around the world and killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people in less than 2 years, Canada was hit with devastating force. In a country with a total population of only about 8 million people, the virus killed somewhere between 50 and 60,000 Canadians in a matter of months, a death toll that exceeded the total Canadian fatalities of the First World War. The pandemic arrived in waves, the second of which in the autumn of 1918 was by far the most lethal, and it behaved in terrifying ways that defied all previous experience of influenza. Unlike most flu strains, which kill primarily the very young and the very old, this one was most deadly to healthy young adults between the ages of 20 and 40. Soldiers returning from the Western Front brought it home with them. Indigenous communities, already weakened by poverty and malnutrition and the disruptions caused by the residential school system, were devastated at rates even higher than the general population. Some remote Arctic communities lost half their populations in days. Fact 12. The clockmaker of the prairies. Somewhere in the flat and wind-scoured landscape of the Canadian prairies, there is a history of timekeeping that most people have never considered. In the decades following Confederation in 1867, one of the most pressing practical challenges facing the new nation was the question of time itself. Before the development of standardized time zones, every city and town in Canada kept its own local time, set according to the position of the sun directly overhead, meaning that a train traveling from Montreal to Toronto would pass through dozens of different local times, making railway scheduling a logistical nightmare of spectacular proportions. It was a Canadian, Sanford Fleming, who proposed the solution to this global problem. Fleming, the engineer responsible for surveying the route of the Canadian Pacific Railway, presented his vision for a worldwide system of standardized time zones to international scientific conferences in the 1870s and 1880s, arguing passionately and with enormous persistence that the world needed to agree on a rational system of dividing the day into uniform zones. Fact 13. The underground city nobody sees. Beneath the streets of Montreal, Canada, there exists one of the most extraordinary urban environments in the world, a vast underground city called Rieso that sprawls for more than 33 kilometers beneath the surface and connects over 2,000 businesses, 10 metro stations, 2 bus terminals, 2 railway stations, a major university, hotels, movie theaters, shopping centers, and the headquarters of numerous major corporations. On a cold January day, when the temperature above ground drops to minus 30 degrees Celsius and the wind makes it feel even colder, hundreds of thousands of Montrealers move through this subterranean network without ever needing to put on a coat. The network began with the construction of Place Ville-Marie in 1962, designed by architect I.M. Pei, which included an underground shopping complex connected to the new metro system. Each subsequent development added new tunnels and connections until the underground city grew organically into the largest underground complex in the world. It has its own microclimate, its own rhythms of morning and evening rush, its own famous landmarks and gathering places. Fact 14. The battle that changed a continent. On the morning of September 13th, 1759, two armies faced each other on a plateau just outside the walls of Quebec City in a battle that would last less than 15 minutes, but would reshape the political destiny of an entire continent for centuries to come. The British General James Wolfe had spent months trying to find a way to attack the seemingly impregnable French fortifications at Quebec, and finally, in a moment of brilliant and desperate improvisation, he discovered a lightly guarded path up the cliffs of the St. Lawrence, and led his army up in the darkness before dawn to seize the high ground known as the Plains of Abraham. The French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, alarmed by the British presence outside his walls, made the fateful decision to march out and meet them in open battle rather than wait behind his defenses. The battle itself was over with stunning speed. British musket discipline shattered the French advance, and both commanders were mortally wounded in the fighting, Wolfe dying on the field and Montcalm dying the following morning. The fall of Quebec effectively ended French military power in North America. Fact 15. The railway that nearly bankrupted a nation. When Canada became a country in 1867, one of the central promises made to bring the distant colony of British Columbia into Confederation was the construction of a transcontinental railway, connecting the Pacific coast to the rest of the country. This promise, made so casually by politicians who had perhaps only the vaguest understanding of the geography involved, turned out to require the completion of one of the most audacious and punishing engineering projects ever attempted. The Canadian Pacific Railway, the line that fulfilled that promise, was built in the early 1880s through terrain that defied description, across the ancient shield of northern Ontario, where blasting through solid rock consumed entire fortunes of dynamite, across the prairies where the flat horizon made the sheer scale of the work feel almost abstract, and then through the Rocky Mountains, where surveyors and engineers encountered challenges that some declared physically impossible to overcome. Fact 16. The language that almost died. In the cities and towns of Quebec and in the French-speaking communities scattered across Canada, from Acadia to Manitoba, there is a language that has survived everything that history could throw at it. French in Canada is not simply a linguistic preference, but a story of extraordinary cultural endurance, of a people who were conquered, marginalized, pressured, economically disadvantaged, and subjected to generations of assimilation policies, and who nevertheless maintained their language and identity through sheer collective determination. After the British conquest of New France in 1759, the French-speaking population of Canada found themselves subjects of an empire that conducted its business in a different language, and that assumed, as empires generally do, that the conquered people would eventually abandon their differences and blend into the dominant culture. That assumption turned out to be spectacularly wrong. The Catholic Church, which remained the center of French Canadian cultural and social life, became the primary guardian of the French language. Priests insisted on French in their schools and their parishes. Families maintained French in their homes across generations. Fact 17. The ghost town with more history than most cities. In the mountains of British Columbia, there's a town called Barkerville that at its peak in the late 1860s was the largest city north of San Francisco and west of Chicago. It grew out of virtually nothing in a matter of months following the discovery of gold on Williams Creek in 1861 by a Cornish miner named Billy Barker, who sank a shaft to a depth that his fellow miners considered pointless, and whose persistence was rewarded with one of the richest gold strikes in the history of British Columbia. Within a year of Barker's discovery, thousands of miners and merchants and gamblers and dancers and saloon keepers and dreamers had poured into the narrow mountain valley, building a town of wooden buildings that stretched for nearly 2 kilometers along the creek bed. At its peak, Barkerville had over 100 businesses, a newspaper, a theater that hosted touring entertainers from San Francisco, churches, schools, and a population that has been estimated at anywhere between 10 and 30,000 people. The gold eventually ran out, the population drained away, and Barkerville became a ghost town. Fact 18. The doctor who changed surgery forever. In a hospital in Montreal, in the winter of 1918, a surgeon named Norman Bethune was performing an operation when he paused to look at his patient and recognized something that changed the course of his life, and through it, the history of medicine. The patient was dying not from lack of surgical skill, but from blood loss, a problem that surgeons at the time considered essentially insurmountable. Bethune became obsessed with the challenge of battlefield blood transfusion, of finding a way to get blood to wounded soldiers quickly enough to keep them alive until proper surgery could be performed. He went to Spain during the Civil War in 1936 and set up the world's first mobile blood transfusion service, creating a system of refrigerated blood banks that traveled with the Republican forces and saved hundreds of lives. He then went to China to work with Mao Zedong's communist forces fighting the Japanese invasion, where he developed mobile surgical units that operated within range of the front lines and performed surgery under conditions that would have seemed impossible to his contemporaries. Fact 19. The soil that feeds the world. There is something buried under the Canadian prairies that is worth more than all the gold and oil and diamonds that have ever been extracted from Canadian soil, and most people walk over it every day without giving it a single thought. The black soil of the prairie provinces, the layer of extraordinarily fertile earth that stretches across Manitoba and Saskatchewan and Alberta, is one of the thickest and richest deposits of agricultural topsoil anywhere on the planet. the accumulated product of thousands of years of grassland ecosystems living and dying and composting into a growing medium of almost supernatural productivity. When European settlers began to break the prairie sod in the latter half of the 19th century, they found soil so rich that it seemed almost too good to be real, soil that could grow wheat of a quality and quantity that transformed global food markets. Saskatchewan alone, a province with a population of barely over 1 million people, produces enough wheat in a good year to feed over 20 million people. Fact 20. The nurse who became a legend. In the summer of 1854, a young Scottish immigrant named Florence Nightingale was not yet famous, but in the wards of a military hospital in the Crimea, she was beginning the work that would make her so. Halfway around the world in the Canadian city of Toronto, a woman named Mary Ann Shadd Carey was doing something far more radical. Shadd Carey, a free black woman from Delaware who had moved to Canada West following the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in the United States, had become the first black woman in North America to found and edit a newspaper. Her publication, the Provincial Freeman, was fiercely abolitionist, promoted black self-reliance and integration over segregation, and challenged the cautious policies of Frederick Douglass himself. Shadd Carey wrote with a directness and a moral clarity that shocked many of her contemporaries and inspired many others. She recruited black soldiers for the Union Army during the American Civil War, returning to the United States and eventually becoming one of the first black women in America to earn a law degree. Fact 21. The treaty that was never kept. In 1876, the government of Canada and the chiefs of the Cree, Assiniboine, and Saulteaux peoples gathered near Fort Carleton in what is now Saskatchewan to negotiate what would become Treaty 6, one in a series of numbered treaties by which the Crown sought to extinguish indigenous land rights across the prairie west in exchange for promises of reserves, annual payments, education, agricultural assistance, and what was described as the medicine chest provision, a promise that the government would provide medical care to the treaty nations. What the indigenous signatories understood they were agreeing to, a shared use of the land while maintaining their sovereignty and way of life, was quite different from what the government understood it was receiving, which was an absolute surrender of title to an area larger than many European countries. The promises made in Treaty 6 and the other numbered treaties were systematically broken almost from the moment the ink dried. Fact 22. The blizzard that invented a warning system. In the winter of 1888, a blizzard struck the North American plains with such sudden and ferocious violence that it became known in Canadian and American memory simply as the school children's blizzard, a name that speaks to its most heartbreaking legacy. The storm appeared with almost no warning on January 12th, arriving on a warm afternoon when children were already at school or walking to school in light clothing, entirely unprepared for what was coming. Within hours, temperatures plummeted from several degrees above freezing to -30 or below, accompanied by a screaming wind that reduced visibility to zero and made even the shortest walk a potentially fatal undertaking. Hundreds of people on both sides of the border died, many of them children who became disoriented, just steps from safety. The disaster galvanized public demand for better weather, forecasting and warning systems, and in Canada, it contributed to the development of the Meteorological Service of Canada's public warning infrastructure. Fact 23. The painting that made a country. In the first 2 decades of the 20th century, a group of painters based in Toronto began doing something that seemed almost perverse to the established art world of their time. Rather than painting in the European academic tradition with its gentle landscapes and dignified portraits and careful rendering of civilized scenes, they drove, and hiked and paddled into the wildest and most forbidding parts of the Canadian landscape. The Canadian Shield with its ancient rocks and twisted pines and cold clear lakes, and they painted it with a directness and a chromatic intensity that was unlike anything that had been seen in Canadian art before. The Group of Seven, as they came to be known, created an aesthetic vision of Canada that was simultaneously a declaration of national identity. Their painting said, in effect, that the harsh and beautiful and magnificent landscape that Europeans had always seen primarily as an obstacle to civilization was in fact the very soul of the country, that Canadians should look at their shield and their prairies and their mountains and feel not intimidation but pride. Fact 24. The secret passage under the Parliament buildings. Beneath the rolling grounds of Parliament Hill in Ottawa, there exists a network of tunnels that most Canadians have never seen and that the government does not generally publicize. These underground passages connect the main Parliament buildings to each other and to several adjacent government structures, allowing politicians, staff, and security personnel to move between buildings without exposure to the Ottawa weather, or, in times of security concern, without public visibility. The tunnels were constructed at various points in the history of the parliamentary precinct, some of them quite old, and others built more recently as security protocols have evolved. Members of Parliament are known to use them during particularly harsh Ottawa winters, when crossing the open ground between buildings becomes genuinely unpleasant. During security lockdowns, they have provided protected movement corridors for essential personnel. The tunnels are only one layer of the hidden infrastructure beneath Parliament Hill, which also includes a sophisticated system of utilities, a protected broadcasting facility, and security installations whose full nature and extent are not public knowledge. Fact 25. The island that launched 1 million Canadians. If you were to trace the family history of a significant portion of the Canadian population, particularly those with roots in Eastern and Central Europe, you would likely find that their ancestors passed through a facility on a small island in the St. Lawrence River near Quebec City. Grosse Isle served from 1832 to 1937 as Canada's primary quarantine station for immigrants arriving by sea, and the story of what happened there is one of the most poignant and complicated chapters in Canadian immigration history. Established in response to the cholera epidemic of 1832, Grosse Isle was the first point of contact with Canada for hundreds of thousands of immigrants, and for many of them, it was a terrifying and sometimes fatal introduction to their new country. The worst years were 1847, when ships carrying famine refugees from Ireland arrived carrying typhus as well as passengers. In that single catastrophic summer, more than 5,000 people died on Grosse Isle and were buried in mass graves on the island's western end. Fact 26. The scientist who found the first vitamin. In a laboratory at the University of Toronto in the autumn of 1921, a young surgeon named Frederick Banting arrived with an idea that his colleagues and superiors considered at best naive and at worst absurd. Banting had been reading about the pancreas and had formed a theory about why the organ's secretions, which everyone knew must contain some substance crucial to the regulation of blood sugar, could never be successfully extracted and tested. The problem, he believed, was that the digestive enzymes in the pancreas were destroying the vital secretion before it could be isolated. His proposed solution, to tie off the pancreatic ducts of dogs and allow the digestive enzyme-producing cells to degenerate while leaving the insulin-producing cells intact, was dismissed by his superiors as unlikely to work. But he persuaded the head of the physiology department, John MacLeod, to lend him laboratory space and a few dogs, and a research assistant named Charles Best. What Banting and Best produced in that laboratory over the following months was insulin, the hormone that regulates blood sugar and whose absence causes diabetes mellitus. Fact 27. The Confederation that almost wasn't. On July 1st, 1867, the British North America Act came into force, and the Dominion of Canada came into being, uniting the provinces of Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick into a single federal state. What most Canadian school children are not taught is just how close the whole project came to collapsing at multiple points, how reluctant many of the key players were, and how the Confederation that finally emerged was far from anyone's first choice. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick were dragged into Confederation over the objections of large portions of their populations by politicians who used various combinations of argument, persuasion, and outright political manipulation to secure the necessary votes. Joseph Howe, Nova Scotia's most celebrated political figure and a passionate opponent of Confederation, spent years after 1867 trying to get his province out of the Union he considered a betrayal of Nova Scotian interests. Prince Edward Island refused to join until 1873, only doing so when offered generous financial terms and a promise of ferry service. Fact 28. The wildfire that erased a town. In the spring of 1910, a fire started in the forest east of Edmonton, Alberta, and what followed was one of the most devastating natural disasters in Canadian prairie history. The town of Slave Lake has been threatened by wildfires repeatedly in its history, but the fire that swept through communities across the Canadian boreal forest in that era demonstrated with terrible clarity how vulnerable human settlement in the northern forest really is. The boreal forest, the vast belt of conifers and mixed woodland that stretches across Canada from the Atlantic to the Pacific and represents roughly a third of the world's total boreal forest, burns. It has always burned. The trees that make up the boreal forest, the spruce and pine and fir, are in many cases adapted to fire in ways that make them actually dependent on periodic burning for reproduction and renewal. The cones of the jack pine, for instance, are serotinous, sealed shut by a resin that only melts in the extreme heat of a wildfire, releasing seeds on the ash and rich soil that fire leaves behind. Fact 29. The inventor of the telephone's Canadian secret. Everyone who passed through the North American school system in the 20th century learned that Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone in 1876, and almost none of them were told that Bell himself considered Canada to be his true home, that he spent his summers for the rest of his life in a small Nova Scotian village called Baddock, that he did much of his most important experimental work there, and that he spent his final decades in a house overlooking the Bras d'Or Lake that he called Bain Breage, beautiful mountain in Gaelic. Bell's connection to Canada began when his family moved from Edinburgh to Brantford, Ontario in 1870 to improve the health of Alexander, who was suffering from tuberculosis. The clean Canadian air did its work, and Bell recovered his health in Brantford. He later worked in Boston and made his famous first telephone transmission there in March 1876, but the concept for the telephone had been sketched out in his notebook while he was staying in Brantford, Ontario, a fact that Canada commemorates with a museum in the city dedicated to his time there. Fact 30. The spy who came in from the cold. During the Second World War, Canada became home to one of the most remarkable and consequential intelligence operations in the history of the conflict. Camp X, established in December 1941 on the north shore of Lake Ontario, near Oshawa, in a location chosen precisely for its proximity to the United States border and its isolation from casual observation, was the first Allied paramilitary training facility in North America, and it trained secret agents from Britain, the United States, and Canada in the arts of sabotage, covert communication, and survival behind enemy lines. The camp was operated by the British Special Operations Executive and produced graduates who went on to conduct operations across occupied Europe. Among those trained there was William Stevenson, the Canadian who had established the British Security Coordination Operation in New York, and who is sometimes credited with inspiring the character of James Bond. Fact 31. The river that flows both ways. In the geography of the Canadian prairies, few features are as practically important or as poetically resonant as the Saskatchewan River system, the network of rivers that drains the water from the Rocky Mountains, east across the plains, and eventually into Lake Winnipeg and Hudson Bay. But there is a river in Canada whose behavior is genuinely peculiar by any standard, and it sits in a very different part of the country. The reversing falls of the St. John River in New Brunswick, where the river meets the Bay of Fundy, experience a phenomenon that baffles many visitors and that has been celebrated as one of the natural wonders of Atlantic Canada. The Bay of Fundy has the highest tides in the world, with a tidal range that can exceed 16 meters, and twice a day the incoming tidal surge is so powerful that it actually reverses the flow of the St. John River, pushing water upstream against its natural current through the narrow gorge at the falls. For a brief period at each tidal transition, the water in the gorge runs neither upstream nor downstream, but sits in a roiling, confused equilibrium of competing forces. Fact 32. The avalanche that buried history. In the Frank slide of April the 29th, 1903, at 4 a.m, while most of the town of Frank, Alberta, lay sleeping, a section of Turtle Mountain estimated to weigh about 90 million tons, broke free and cascaded down the slope at a speed of over 100 kilometers per hour, bearing the eastern edge of the town, the coal mine entrance, a section of the railway, and an estimated 70 to 90 people in less than 2 minutes. It remains the deadliest rock slide in Canadian history and one of the largest in North American recorded history. The causes of the collapse were a combination of factors, including the geological instability of Turtle Mountain itself, the weakening of the mountain's base by extensive coal mining, and the cold temperatures of the previous night that may have expanded water in the rock's many fractures. 17 miners who had been working the night shift underground survived by digging their way out through the rubble. 3 children sleeping in a house that was half buried were found alive beneath the debris. Fact 33. The peacekeeping nation and its complicated truth. In the popular imagination of the world and in the self-image that many Canadians hold most dear, Canada is a peacekeeping nation, a middle power that has consistently deployed its military not to conquer or dominate, but to stand between warring parties and help fragile ceasefires hold. This reputation was built largely on the work of Lester Pearson, a Canadian diplomat who in 1956 proposed the creation of a United Nations emergency force to address the Suez Crisis, in which Britain, France, and Israel had invaded Egypt over the nationalization of the Suez Canal. Pearson's proposal, which created the template for modern United Nations peacekeeping, won him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1957 and gave Canada a foreign policy identity that it has drawn on ever since. What is less often acknowledged is the gap between that idealized image and some of the more complicated realities of Canadian military history. Fact 34. The town that refused to die. There is a community in Newfoundland called Fogo Island that sits in the cold waters of the North Atlantic off the northeast coast of the island, and that, by every economic logic of the 20th century, should have disappeared decades ago. The cod fishery that had sustained Fogo Island for 4 centuries collapsed in the 1990s, leaving the island's population with no obvious economic future. The federal government's resettlement programs, which had already moved thousands of outport Newfoundlanders off their remote communities into larger centers, eyed Fogo Island as a candidate for closure. but the people of Fogo Island refused to go. In the late 1960s, they had already fought off one resettlement attempt by working with filmmaker Colin Lowe to document their own lives and communities in a series of films that became landmarks of participatory documentary cinema. Decades later, when an island family named Cobb used proceeds from a technology fortune to invest in an extraordinary architect-designed hotel on the island's windswept coast, a new chapter began. Fact 35. The ice hotel that melts every year. Just outside Quebec City, every winter since 1999, workers have constructed one of the most extraordinary temporary hotels in the world. The Hotel de Glace is built entirely from snow and ice, with walls of compacted snow, furniture carved from ice blocks, a chapel where real weddings are performed, an ice slide, hot tub sunk into the snow, and a bar where drinks are served in glasses made of ice. The hotel takes several weeks to build, requires the labor of hundreds of workers and artists, uses approximately 15,000 tons of snow and 500 tons of ice, and maintains an interior temperature of somewhere between -5 and -2 degrees Celsius, even when the outside air is much colder. Guests sleep in sleeping bags on beds of ice covered with furs and mattresses, and report that the sleeping experience, cocooned in a quiet world of blue-white ice, is unlike anything else they have ever done. The hotel stands for roughly 10 weeks each winter before the warming spring temperatures begin their inevitable work. Every year it melts completely away, every last trace of it gone by summer, and every year it is built again from scratch. Fact 36. The province that was its own dominion. Before Newfoundland joined Canada in 1949, it had been through one of the most unusual political experiments in the history of the British Empire. From 1907 to 1934, Newfoundland was a self-governing dominion of the British Crown, with full control of its own affairs and the same constitutional status as Canada and Australia. The financial catastrophe of the Great Depression, combined with the enormous debts Newfoundland had accumulated fighting the First World War at a per capita rate of sacrifice that exceeded almost every other nation, brought the Dominion to the point of bankruptcy. In 1934, the Newfoundland legislature voted to suspend its own self-government and hand control of the island back to an appointed commission of government, a group of 6 commissioners, 3 Newfoundlanders and 3 Britons, who governed the island without democracy for the next 15 years. It was the only time in the 20th century that a self-governing British Dominion voluntarily surrendered its democracy. Fact 37. The forgotten soldiers of 2 wars. In the histories of the First and Second World Wars, written from the Canadian perspective, there is a gap that only in recent decades has begun to receive serious attention. Over 4,000 Indigenous Canadians served in the Canadian Expeditionary Force during the First World War, and over 3,000 more served in the Second. These men and women volunteered at rates higher than the general Canadian population in many communities, serving with distinction in some of the most famous engagements of both conflicts. Private Mike Mountain Horse of the Kainai Nation served in France. Francis Pegamagabo of the Ojibwe Nation became the most decorated Indigenous Canadian soldier of the First World War, a scout and sniper of legendary skill who was mentioned in dispatches for his bravery 3 times and received the military medal with 2 bars. And yet, when these soldiers came home, they returned to the same restrictions and discriminations that had applied before they left. Indigenous veterans were denied many of the benefits available to other Canadian veterans. The Veterans Land Act farms were made available to non-Indigenous veterans, but not always to Indigenous ones. Fact 38. The National Park, built on broken promises. Banff National Park, established in 1885 as Canada's first national park, and now one of the most visited tourist destinations in the world, with its turquoise glacial lakes and snow-capped peaks and picture postcard mountain scenery, was created by the Government of Canada through the expropriation of lands that Indigenous peoples had used and inhabited for thousands of years. The Nakota people, also known as the Stoney Nakota, had lived in and around the Bow Valley, the mountain valley where Banff sits, since time beyond memory. They knew every trail and valley and campsite, every plant that could be eaten, and every animal that could be hunted. When the government established the park, the Nakota were pushed out of their traditional territories and placed on a reserve outside the park boundary. They were forbidden to hunt in the park, forbidden to gather the plants they had always gathered, and effectively excluded from land that was the core of their cultural and spiritual world. Fact 39. The radio voice that shaped a nation. On November 2nd, 1936, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation went on air for the first time, and the voice that spoke out across the nation on that inaugural broadcast came from a medium that Canadians in remote communities, in fishing villages and farming towns and northern outposts had come to depend on for news and entertainment, and the simple comfort of knowing that the rest of the country was out there. The creation of the CBC was itself a story of national anxiety and deliberate policy choice. By the early 1930s, it had become clear that without intervention, the Canadian radio landscape would be dominated by American stations broadcasting American content, and that Canadian voices and Canadian stories would be crowded out by the sheer weight of American cultural production. The Massey Commission, the Aird Commission, and various parliamentary inquiries all reached the same conclusion, that a public broadcaster was essential if Canada was to maintain a distinct cultural identity in the shadow of its enormous southern neighbor. Fact 40. The polar bear. Capital that almost wasn't. In the subarctic town of Churchill, Manitoba, sitting on the western shore of Hudson Bay, at the point where the boreal forest meets the tundra, there takes place every autumn one of the most extraordinary wildlife spectacles on Earth. Hundreds of polar bears gather near Churchill as they wait for Hudson Bay to freeze, because the sea ice is where they hunt the ringed seals that make up the bulk of their diet, and Churchill sits at the point where the bay freezes earliest each autumn. This congregation of polar bears so close to a human community is unique in the world, and the wildlife tourism industry that has grown up around it has transformed Churchill from a remote and economically struggling northern outpost into an internationally recognized destination. The town itself is accessible only by air or by rail, the railway that reaches it being one of the last working passenger railway routes in the Canadian North, and its population hovers around 900 people. Fact 41. The sunken city. Under the lake, beneath the surface of Lac Memphremagog, the long, narrow lake that straddles the border between Quebec and Vermont, there are stories and rumors of structures on the lake bottom that date to the era of settlement, buildings and roads and foundations that were inundated when water levels changed, or dams were built. But the most famous sunken history in Canadian waters is found in the St. Lawrence River near Brockville, Ontario, where the Thousand Islands region has become famous not only for its beauty above the waterline, but for the remarkable wreck. Diving available below it, the river here is littered with the remains of ships that sank over the course of centuries of intensive navigation. From wooden sailing vessels of the 18th century to steel-hulled steamships of the early 20th, and the cold, fresh water of the St. Lawrence has preserved many of these wrecks with extraordinary fidelity. Divers can swim through the holds of freighters that sank 100 years ago, still finding intact glassware and crockery and personal belongings on the cabin shelves, a frozen moment from the era when the St. Lawrence was one of the busiest waterways in North America. Fact 42. The moose that changed an island. When moose were introduced to Newfoundland in 1878, and again in 1904, the animals brought from New Brunswick to stock the island for hunting purposes Nobody could have predicted the ecological transformation that would follow. Newfoundland had no native moose population and no predators capable of controlling large ungulates. The island's forests, shaped by thousands of years of ecological history that had not included moose, had no defenses against their browsing. The moose population exploded, growing from the handful of animals introduced at the turn of the century to a population that today numbers well over 100,000 animals, and that has fundamentally altered the composition and structure of Newfoundland's forests. Areas that were once dense with young balsam fir, the moose's preferred food, have been stripped and replaced by other species less palatable to moose. The understory of the forest has changed. The wildlife that depends on those forest structures has changed with it. And the moose themselves, having reached carrying capacity, cycle through boom and bust population swings that drive equally dramatic changes in the landscape. Fact 43. The judge who freed a nation's future. On November 1st, 1929, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London, then Canada's highest court of appeal, issued a ruling that changed the political history of Canada in ways that continue to resonate. The question before the court was whether the word persons in Section 24 of the British North America Act, which stated that the Governor-General shall summon qualified persons to the Senate, included women. The Supreme Court of Canada had already ruled that it did not, that persons in the constitutional context meant male persons, and always had. 5 Canadian women, known to history as the Famous Five, led by Emily Murphy and including Nellie McClung, Louise McKinney, Irene Parlby, and Henrietta Muir Edwards, had launched the legal challenge to this interpretation. The Privy Council overturned the Supreme Court of Canada and declared that women were indeed persons within the meaning of the B&A Act and were therefore eligible for appointment to the Senate. Fact 44. The train that ran on a dream. When the Canadian Pacific Railway was completed in 1885, connecting the Atlantic provinces to British Columbia by rail for the first time, it fulfilled a promise that had kept British Columbia in Confederation, when the province might otherwise have left, but it also created a new kind of Canadian experience, the transcontinental journey. For decades after its completion, the CPR's passenger service offered travelers a journey of astonishing duration and variety, a crossing of the entire continent by train that took days and passed through some of the most dramatic landscapes on Earth. By the mid-20th century, that journey had been consolidated into the Canadian, a sleek, stainless steel passenger train introduced by the CPR in 1955 that became one of the iconic passenger rail experiences in the world. The train's domed observation cars allowed passengers to sit above the level of the carriage roof and look out in all directions at the landscape flowing past, the prairies spreading to every horizon, the mountains rising up in layers of purple and white, the forests of British Columbia descending toward the Pacific. Fact 45. The disaster that gave Canada its Coast Guard. In the early morning hours of July 29th, 1914, the Norwegian cargo ship Empress of Ireland was lying at anchor in the fog of the St. Lawrence River near Rimouski, Quebec, waiting out the thick fog before proceeding to sea. The Norwegian coal ship Storstad, whose navigator had seen the Empress's lights through the fog and believed she was moving clear of the channel, struck the Empress amidships in the darkness. The Empress sank in 14 minutes before most passengers could be awakened, before most lifeboats could be lowered, in water so cold that even those who made it off the ship had only minutes before hypothermia claimed them. Of the 1,477 people aboard, only 465 survived. The death toll of 1,012 people made it the deadliest maritime disaster in Canadian history, surpassing even the loss of the Titanic 2 years earlier in absolute numbers of deaths, though it received far less enduring attention from history. The disaster exposed critical gaps in marine safety regulations and search and rescue capacity along the St. Lawrence and the investigations and reforms that followed contributed to the eventual establishment of a proper Canadian Coast Guard service. Fact 46. The ghost that haunts Confederation. Among the founding fathers of Confederation, no figure is more complicated or more necessary to understand than Thomas D'Arcy McGee, the Irish-Canadian politician and poet who was one of the most passionate and eloquent voices in favor of the new Canadian nation, and who was also the first, and to date only, victim of political assassination in Canadian history. McGee had been a revolutionary Irish nationalist in his youth, involved in the failed Young Ireland Rising of 1848, before he emigrated to North America and reinvented himself as a moderate, pro-British Canadian politician and writer of considerable gifts. His vision of Canada as a nation where different peoples and faiths could coexist in mutual respect was ahead of its time and genuinely moving. His enemies, particularly within the Fenian Brotherhood of Irish nationalists who considered his pro-British politics a betrayal, viewed him with active hatred. On April 7, 1868, just 1 year after Confederation, McGee returned from a late parliamentary sitting in Ottawa and was shot dead on the doorstep of his boarding house on Spark Street. He was 42 years old. Fact 47. The river that made the West. The Red River, which flows northward through the flat glacial lake bed of what is now southern Manitoba, seems at first glance an unlikely candidate for one of the most historically significant waterways in Canadian history. It is not particularly long or wide or dramatic. It does not plunge through mountain gorges or cascade over spectacular falls. But the Red River Valley, formed by the ancient bed of glacial Lake Agassiz, contains some of the most fertile agricultural soil in the world, and the communities that grew up along its banks in the first half of the 19th century became the nucleus of the eventual province of Manitoba and the seed from which the settlement of the Canadian prairies grew. The Red River Settlement, established by the Selkirk settlers in 1812, and home to the Métis Nation, whose culture arose from the union of fur trade relationships between European men and Indigenous women, was also the site of one of the most consequential conflicts in Canadian history. Fact 48. The telephone pole that carries secrets. In the small community of Flin Flon, which straddles the border between Manitoba and Saskatchewan in the rocky wilderness of the Canadian Shield, there stands a peculiar monument to the power of corporate placemaking in the Canadian North. Flin Flon was named not after a historical person or a geographic feature, but after a fictional character, a professor, Josiah Flynn Abedy Flanagan, the hero of a dime novel called The Sunless City, who discovers an underground civilization beneath a bottomless lake. A prospector found a copy of the novel at the site of the future town, and was struck by the resemblance between the novel setting and the landscape of the Shield, and the name stuck. The town grew up around a massive copper and zinc mine and smelter complex operated by Hudson Bay. Mining and smelting, and for much of the 20th century it was a company town in the fullest sense, with the mining company owning most of the housing, the town's infrastructure, and much of its economic life. Fact 49. The Arctic sovereignty. Claim that almost wasn't. Canada's claim to sovereignty over the Arctic archipelago, the vast collection of islands that stretches from the northern coast of the mainland all the way to within 800 kilometers of the North Pole, is one of the most geopolitically significant territorial claims in the world, and has always been less secure than Canadians generally assume. The legal basis for Canadian sovereignty over the high Arctic islands rests partly on the sector principle, The argument that Canada owns all the land within a theoretical triangle extending from its continental territory to the North Pole, and partly on effective occupation and administration of the territory. For much of the 20th century, Canada's effective presence in the high Arctic was so minimal that its claims might have been challenged successfully. The American and Soviet operations that crisscrossed Arctic airspace and occasionally landed on Arctic territory during the Cold War era-tested Canadian sovereignty in ways that the government found deeply uncomfortable. Fact 50. The scientist who named the dinosaur's backyard. In the Badlands of southern Alberta, along the valley of the Red Deer River, where erosion has carved the soft sediments of ancient river deltas into spectacular formations of hoodoos and coulees and ravines, lies one of the richest dinosaur fossil deposits in the world. Dinosaur Provincial Park, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, has yielded the remains of over 40 distinct dinosaur species from the Cretaceous period, including some of the most complete and scientifically important specimens ever found. The fossil fields here were first extensively explored by Joseph Burr Tyrrell in 1884, who was actually looking for coal deposits on behalf of the Geological Survey of Canada when he stumbled upon the skull of a large theropod dinosaur that would later be named Albertosaurus in honor of the province. Tyrrell's discovery set off a period of intense paleontological activity in the Badlands that historians call the Great Dinosaur Rush, during which the major natural history museums of North America competed to extract as many specimens as possible from the Alberta beds. Fact 51. The forest that breathes. In the ancient temperate rainforest of British Columbia's Pacific coast, there are trees alive today that were already old when Columbus was born. The coastal temperate rainforest of British Columbia, which includes the Great Bear Rainforest on the province's central and north coast and extends south through Vancouver Island and the Queen Charlotte Islands, or Haida Gwaii as they are now officially known, is one of the rarest ecosystems on Earth. Temperate rainforest, the kind that grows where mild temperatures meet exceptional rainfall, once covered much of the Pacific coast of North America, but so much of it has been logged that only a small fraction of the original forest remains. What survives in the most protected areas of the Great Bear Rainforest is a cathedral-like environment of Douglas fir, western red cedar, and Sitka spruce trees of almost incomprehensible size and age. The red cedars in particular can live for over 1,000 years, their trunks swelling to diameters of several meters, their buttressed roots spreading across the forest floor like the foundations of ancient temples. Fact 52. The muskrat that started a nation. In the spring of 1870, a small delegation of Métis leaders arrived in Ottawa to negotiate the terms under which the Red River settlement would enter Confederation as the new province of Manitoba. The delegation, which included one of Louis Riel's closest associates, was negotiating in the aftermath of the resistance that Riel had led against Canada's unilateral takeover of Rupert's Land, and the terms they secured were remarkable by the standards of the time. The Manitoba Act of 1870 guaranteed French language rights, protected Catholic schools, and set aside 1.4 million acres of land for the children of Métis families. It was a settlement that recognized Métis rights more explicitly than any other provincial founding document in Canadian history. And yet, within a decade, most of those rights had been systematically undermined. Land grants were delayed and maneuvered into the hands of speculators. Language rights were eroded. The federal government sent surveyors and settlers who treated the Métis land claims with contempt. Riel himself was driven into exile in the United States. Fact 53. The mountain that kills its climbers. Mount Logan in the Yukon Territory is the highest peak in Canada and the second highest mountain in North America after Denali in Alaska. At 5,959 meters, it dominates the St. Elias Mountains at the junction of Yukon and Alaska, with a mass so enormous that it has the largest base circumference of any non-volcanic mountain on Earth. The mountain was not even known to the outside world until the early 20th century, hidden as it was in one of the most inaccessible corners of the continent, and it was not climbed until 1925, when an expedition led by Albert McCarthy reached the summit after a grueling journey of over 60 days from the coast. Logan's weather is notoriously savage even by the standards of high-altitude mountaineering, with storms that can pin climbers to a wind-swept plateau for weeks and temperatures that can drop to minus 50 degrees Celsius. The mountain has its own microclimate, capable of generating storms of extraordinary violence, while the weather in the surrounding valleys appears benign. The approach alone across the vast and crevassed Kaskawulsh Glacier is a serious undertaking that has killed experienced mountaineers who underestimated it. Fact 54. The Confederation Bridge that divided an island. When the Confederation Bridge opened in 1997, it fulfilled a 125-year-old promise that had been made to Prince Edward Island at the time of Confederation to provide year-round communication with the mainland. The bridge, at 12.9 kilometers, is the longest bridge over ice-covered waters in the world, an extraordinary engineering achievement that was built in sections in a factory and assembled on the frigid waters of Northumberland Strait. For the island's population, it represented the end of a particular kind of isolation, the ferry crossing that had always been the unavoidable gateway to and from the mainland. But the bridge also divided opinion on the island in a way that the debate leading up to its construction and the referendum that approved it never fully resolved. Those who favored the bridge saw it as economic development, easier access for tourists and goods, and the long overdue fulfillment of Confederation's promise. Fact 55. The oil sands that changed the world. In the forests and muskeg of northeastern Alberta, there lies beneath the surface one of the largest deposits of petroleum in the world, the Athabasca oil sands, a resource so vast and so difficult to extract that for most of the 20th century it sat almost untouched, awaiting the combination of high oil prices and improved extraction technology that would make its development economically feasible. The indigenous peoples of the region, particularly the Cree and Diné nations, had known of the bituminous sands for centuries, using the tar that seeped to the surface to waterproof their canoes. European explorers noted the phenomenon with curiosity, but the idea of extracting the bitumen at scale and converting it to usable oil seemed fantastical until the later decades of the 20th century, when the technology for surface mining, the shallow deposits, and for steam assisted extraction of the deeper ones made it possible. The development that followed transformed northern Alberta and Canadian energy politics, making Canada one of the largest oil producers in the world and giving it reserves that at some estimates exceed those of Saudi Arabia. Fact 56. The War Memorial that weeps. In the National Capital Region of Ottawa, there is a building that most tourists do not visit and that most Canadians have never seen from the inside, and yet it is one of the most emotionally charged places in the country. The National War Memorial, which stands in Confederation Square just outside Parliament Hill, depicts a triumphal arch through which a procession of soldiers, sailors, and nurses passes, cast in bronze and frozen in the moment of departure for war. In front of the arch stands the bronze figure of two allegorical figures representing peace and freedom. The memorial was unveiled in 1939, just months before Canada would once again go to war, by King George VI during his historic royal tour of Canada. It was built to honor the dead of the First World War, but it has since become a place of remembrance for all of Canada's war dead, and on Remembrance Day, each year the ceremony at the memorial draws thousands of veterans, dignitaries and citizens to stand in the cold November air and consider the cost of the conflicts that have shaped the country. Fact 57. The village on the edge of the world. On the northeastern tip of Ellesmere Island, the most northerly land in Canada and one of the most northerly pieces of land on the surface of the earth, there sits a Canadian Forces station called Alert, which holds the distinction of being the northernmost permanently inhabited settlement in the world, sitting at a latitude of over 82 degrees north. The station is approximately 817 kilometers from the North Pole, closer to the pole than to most Canadian cities, and it exists in a landscape of such extreme remoteness and such brutal climate that its small population of rotating military and civilian personnel must be entirely self-sufficient. In midwinter, Alert experiences roughly 5 months of polar night, during which the sun does not rise above the horizon at all. In high summer, the sun does not set for several months. The average temperature in January is around minus 40 degrees Celsius, and the wind can make it feel far colder. Alert was established in 1950 during the early Cold War period, when Canadian and American strategists recognized that the Arctic had become strategically important as the shortest route between North America and the Soviet Union. Fact 58. The salmon run that moves mountains. Every autumn in the rivers of British Columbia, there occurs a natural event of such biological intensity and ecological consequence that scientists have spent decades trying to fully understand it. The Pacific salmon, which spend most of their adult lives in the open ocean, return to the freshwater rivers and streams where they were hatched to spawn and die in numbers that can seem almost impossible to comprehend. The Fraser River system alone sees the return of tens of millions of sockeye salmon in a good year, a migration so large that the river can appear red with fish, and so powerful in its ecological effects that the salmon themselves become a mechanism for transferring marine nutrients deep into the interior of the continent. When the salmon die after spawning, their decomposing bodies fertilize the riverbanks and the forests that grow along them. Isotope analysis of ancient trees growing beside salmon-bearing streams shows the presence of marine nitrogen in their wood, nitrogen that could only have arrived via the bodies of dead salmon, meaning that the forest and the fish have been exchanging nutrients across the boundary between land and water for thousands of years. Fact 59. The flag that took forever. Until 1965, Canada did not have its own national flag. For nearly a century after Confederation, the country used a version of the British Red Ensign as its de facto national flag, a design that incorporated the Union Jack and was never officially adopted by Parliament, but that had come into widespread use through custom and precedent. The debate about creating a distinctly Canadian flag had been simmering for decades, and when Prime Minister Lester Pearson moved to resolve it in 1964, he unleashed one of the most bitter and prolonged parliamentary debates in Canadian history. Pearson's preferred design, incorporating 3 red maple leaves, was rejected. The version that eventually emerged from the Great Canadian Flag debate, as historians call it, was the single red maple leaf on a white ground, with red borders that became one of the most recognizable national symbols in the world. The debate that produced it lasted 6 months, generated 1,500 speeches in Parliament, and generated such passionate opposition that Conservative leader John Diefenbaker, who wanted to keep the Union Jack in the design, became almost physically ill with distress over the change. Fact 60. The lake that killed its own fish. In the 1950s and 1960s, the Great Lakes, the largest system of freshwater lakes in the world by surface area, holding about 20% of the world's surface fresh water, were dying. Decades of industrial pollution, urban sewage discharge, and agricultural runoff had turned lakes Erie and Ontario in particular, into bodies of water so degraded that their fish populations had collapsed. Their beaches were closed to swimming, and the surface of Lake Erie occasionally caught fire from the hydrocarbons floating on it. The Cuyahoga River, which flows into Lake Erie at Cleveland, caught fire multiple times, most famously in 1969, an event that helped galvanize the environmental movement and contributed to the passage of the Clean Water Act in the United States and parallel legislation in Canada. The Great Lakes. Water Quality Agreement of 1972 between Canada and the United States set binding targets for the reduction of pollution and established the International Joint Commission as the oversight body for the cleanup effort. What followed was one of the most successful environmental restoration projects in history. Lake Erie, which was declared dead in the late 1960s, came back to life. Fact 61. The Métis leader who changed everything. Louis Riel has been called a traitor and a hero, a murderer and a martyr, a visionary and a madman, and the remarkable thing is that all of these descriptions contain some measure of truth. Born in 1844 on the Red River settlement to a French Métis father and a French-Canadian mother, Riel grew up in a community that lived uneasily at the intersection of indigenous and European cultures, speaking French and Cree and English, hunting buffalo on horseback and attending Catholic Mass on Sunday, maintaining a way of life that belonged fully to neither the indigenous world nor the European one, but had its own distinct character and its own fierce pride. When Canada moved to annex the Red River settlement in 1869, Riel emerged as the leader of the Métis resistance, establishing a provisional government and negotiating the terms of Manitoba's entry into Confederation. His execution of Thomas Scott, a Protestant Ontario Orangeman who had been involved in armed resistance against the provisional government, made him permanently enemies in English Canada. Fact 62. The Arctic expedition that vanished. On May 19, 1845, two ships of the Royal Navy, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, commanded by Sir John Franklin, sailed from the Thames River in England on an expedition to complete the mapping of the Northwest Passage, the sea route through the Arctic archipelago connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific that had been the obsession of European explorers for centuries. Franklin had 128 officers and men and enough provisions for 3 years. The expedition was the best equipped Arctic venture ever sent by the Royal Navy. Nobody in England ever saw them again. The ships became icebound in Victoria Strait in September 1846 and were never freed. Franklin himself died in June 1847. The remaining survivors abandoned the ships in April 1848 and began a terrible march south across King William Island, and they all died before reaching any settlement or rescue. Over the following century and a half, numerous expeditions searched for the lost ships and gradually pieced together the story of the disaster from fragmentary notes, cairns, artifacts, and the accounts of Inuit witnesses who had encountered the survivors. Fact 63. The War on the Home Front. During the Second World War, Canada became the training ground for pilots from across the British Commonwealth through the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, the largest and most ambitious pilot training program in history. Over the course of the war, more than 130,000 aircrew were trained at over 100 airfields spread across Canada, a country chosen for the program because its vast open spaces provided room for training. Its distance from the war zone provided safety, and its weather, while sometimes challenging, was reliably free of the European fog and overcast that hampered training in Britain. The plan transformed dozens of small Canadian towns and cities. Brandon and Moose Jaw and Portage la Prairie and dozens of other communities suddenly found themselves home to training facilities full of young men from Britain and Australia and New Zealand and South Africa, speaking in accents that had never been heard in those places before, filling the local hotels and dance halls and churches with a cosmopolitan presence that many residents found both exciting and occasionally alarming. Fact 64. The province that doesn't quite fit. When the Canadian Constitution was drafted and later amended over the years, the framers created a federal system in which the provinces have significant powers over their own affairs in areas like education, healthcare, property rights, and civil law. Quebec has always used these provincial powers with particular intensity in the service of protecting and promoting its distinct francophone culture, but there is an aspect of Quebec's distinctiveness that goes beyond language policy and cultural promotion into the fundamental structure of the law itself. Quebec is the only province in Canada that uses a civil law system based on the French Napoleonic Code rather than the English common law tradition that governs the other 9 provinces. The difference is not merely technical. Civil law and common law are genuinely different ways of organizing legal relationships, with different philosophies about the role of codified rules versus judicial precedent, about the nature of contract and property and family relationships. In civil law, the rules are written in a comprehensive code that judges interpret and apply. Fact 65. The cold lake that swallowed a city. In the summer of 1968, the town of Valleyfield in Saskatchewan did something that no Canadian municipality had ever done before, and few have done since. Facing the planned flooding of the South Saskatchewan River Valley behind the newly constructed Gardner Dam, the town picked up and moved. The reservoir behind the Gardner Dam, named Lake Diefenbaker, after the Prime Minister whose government authorized its construction, would cover the land on which Valleyfield sat and on which several other communities had stood. Over the course of several years, houses were lifted off their foundations and moved to new sites. Cemeteries were relocated, grave by grave. Churches were dismantled and rebuilt, and the accumulated physical fabric of communities that had existed for generations was systematically transplanted to higher ground. The reservoir itself, when it filled, covered some of the most productive agricultural land in Saskatchewan, land that had been farmed by settlers for decades, and that had been the homeland of the Nakota and other indigenous peoples for much longer before that. Fact 66. The animal that defines a country. There is perhaps no more perfectly Canadian story than the story of the Hudson's Bay Company, the trading enterprise that was chartered by King Charles II of England in 1670, and that, for the better part of 2 centuries, effectively governed nearly half of what is now Canada. The company was given sovereignty over all the land draining into Hudson Bay, a territory called Rupert's Land that encompassed over 7.7 million square kilometers, roughly 4 times the size of Great Britain, an area the king gave away with the casual grandeur of a man who had absolutely no idea how large it was. The company traded primarily in beaver furs, establishing a network of trading posts across this vast territory and maintaining commercial and diplomatic relationships with the indigenous peoples who trapped the furs on which the entire enterprise depended. For 2 centuries, the Hudson's Bay Company was not merely a trading company, but a quasi-governmental entity with its own laws, its own courts, its own military capacity, and its own foreign policy. Fact 67. The Northern Lights and what they mean. In the night skies over the boreal forests and tundra of northern Canada, on clear cold nights when the geomagnetic conditions are right, the aurora borealis paints the darkness with curtains and waves of colored light that have been inspiring wonder and stories for as long as human beings have looked up at the sky. The Inuit of the Arctic have their own rich traditions of understanding the northern lights, traditions that vary across different communities and regions. Some understood the lights as the spirits of the dead playing games with a walrus skull in the sky. Others saw them as signs of weather or fortune. The Cree peoples of the boreal forest had their own interpretations, and some accounts describe the lights as the spirits of those who died. Violent deaths dancing in the sky. European explorers and settlers who encountered the aurora for the first time were universally awestruck and often terrified, interpreting the displays through the framework of their own cultural and religious traditions. Fact 68. The scientist who mapped the bottom of the ocean. Marie Tharp was not Canadian, but the work of understanding the deep ocean basins that she pioneered in the mid-20th century was paralleled in Canada by a tradition of oceanographic science centered at institutions like the Bedford Institute of Oceanography in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, established in 1962 as the largest oceanographic research facility in Canada. The Institute's scientists have spent decades mapping and studying the waters of the Canadian continental shelf, the Grand Banks, the Labrador Sea, and the deeper Atlantic basins that lie offshore of Canada's eastern coastline. What they discovered and continue to discover about these waters is of extraordinary importance, not only for the fishing industries that depend on understanding fish stocks and ocean conditions, but for the global understanding of climate change, ocean circulation, and the deep processes that regulate the planet's temperature. Fact 69. The town built on a salt mine. Beneath the streets of Pugwash, Nova Scotia, and beneath the waters of the Pugwash River estuary lies one of the largest underground salt deposits in North America, and the story of how this resource was discovered and developed is a microcosm of the industrial transformation of rural Atlantic Canada in the 19th and 20th centuries. But Pugwash is known to the world primarily not for its salt, but for a series of conferences that began there in 1957, when the industrialist Cyrus Eaton invited a group of scientists from East and West to discuss the dangers of nuclear weapons in the early years of the Cold War. The Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, named after the Nova Scotia village where they began, became one of the most important forums for dialogue between Soviet and Western scientists during the nuclear arms race, providing a back channel for communication that operated when official diplomatic channels were frozen. In 1995, the Pugwash Conferences and their Secretary General, Joseph Rotblat, shared the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts toward nuclear disarmament. Fact 70. The Island of Bones. In the rich marine waters surrounding Haida, Guay, the archipelago off the coast of British Columbia that is the traditional homeland of the Haida Nation, there are archaeological sites that have revealed evidence of human habitation stretching back over 10,000 years, making them among the oldest known human settlements in North America. The Haida are one of the most artistically sophisticated cultures ever to have existed on the continent, producing monumental wood sculptures, intricately carved ceremonial objects, and richly symbolic visual art that influenced artists around the world after its rediscovery by European collectors in the 19th century. The totem poles created by Haida carvers, which can reach heights of over 20 meters and contain layers of genealogical, historical, and spiritual information that takes years to learn to read, are among the most complex works of public art produced by any culture at any time. But the Haida were also warrior traders whose ocean-going canoes carried them as far south as California and as far north as Alaska, and whose territorial reach across the northern Pacific made them a power that no European newcomer could ignore. Fact 71. The railway strike that changed labor rights. In August 1919, the city of Winnipeg experienced the culmination of a general strike that had begun in May of that year and that had been building for much longer in the discontent of returning war veterans, the frustration of industrial workers, and the spreading influence of socialist ideas that had been invigorated by the Russian Revolution of 1917. The Winnipeg General Strike began on May 15, 1919, when over 30,000 workers walked off the job in sympathy with workers in the building and metal trades who had been refused the right to collective bargaining. For 6 weeks, almost all essential services in the city ceased or were maintained only by volunteers, and the strike became a national cause that polarized opinion between those who saw it as legitimate labor activism and those who saw it as an attempt at revolution. The federal government intervened forcefully. Immigration authorities were given new powers to deport foreign-born strike leaders. The Royal Northwest Mounted Police charged a crowd of demonstrators on what became known as Bloody Saturday, June 21st, killing 2 people and injuring dozens more. The strike was broken. Fact 72. The Legend of the Ogopogo. In the cool blue waters of Okanagan Lake in British Columbia, there is said to live a creature. The lake is one of the longest and deepest in the province, stretching nearly 135 kilometers through the Okanagan Valley and reaching depths of over 230 meters in places, more than enough room to conceal any number of mysteries. The indigenous Syilx peoples of the Okanagan had their own stories of a powerful and dangerous water spirit they called Naitaka that lived in the lake and demanded tribute from those who crossed its waters, offerings of small animals to be thrown into the water to satisfy the creature's appetite and ensure safe passage. European settlers adopted and transformed these stories, and reports of a large, unknown animal in the lake began accumulating in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, coalescing around the name Ogopogo, which appears to have originated in a music hall song. The creature became one of Canada's most beloved pieces of folklore, a gentle but persistent mystery that has spawned tourist industries, newspaper investigations, amateur monster hunts, and occasional apparently serious scientific inquiries. Fact 73. The Quarrel That Built a Constitution. In the spring of 1982, something happened in Canada that seemed almost mundane by the standards of international constitutional drama, but that was, in fact, one of the most significant moments in the country's political history. On April 17, 1982, Queen Elizabeth II signed the Constitution Act in a ceremony on Parliament Hill in Ottawa, bringing into force the first fully Canadian Constitution, one that included for the first time a charter of rights and freedoms that guaranteed the fundamental rights of all Canadians and established the Supreme Court of Canada as the ultimate arbiter of constitutional questions. For the first time in its history, Canada had fully patriated its constitution, ending the formal tie to the British Parliament that had existed since Confederation. The achievement was accompanied by an enormous political rupture. Fact 74. The Healer of the Ice Fields. In the late summer of 1967, a young Canadian named Norman Bethune, no relation to the earlier Norman Bethune, though perhaps inspired by that doctor's legacy, arrived in a remote Inuit community in the Northwest Territories and encountered a medical situation that illustrated everything that was wrong with the way Canadian healthcare reached the most remote communities in the North. The community had been promised a nurse, but the nurse had not come. Basic medications were unavailable. Conditions that in a southern city would have been treated easily were killing people in the north because the infrastructure of medicine simply did not reach far enough. Fact 75. The Sunken Treasure of the Great Lakes. In the waters of the Great Lakes, beneath the cold, fresh water that holds some of the best natural preservation conditions in the world, there lie thousands of shipwrecks spanning centuries of maritime history. The Great Lakes, despite being inland freshwater bodies, functioned for centuries as the primary highway of transportation for the interior of the continent, and the volume of shipping that moved through them was enormous. the Edmund Fitzgerald, which sank in a November gale on Lake Superior in 1975 with the loss of all 29 crew members, and was immortalized in a song by Gordon Lightfoot, is perhaps the most famous of these lost ships, but it is only one of thousands. Lake Superior alone is believed to hold over 500 identified wrecks, and potentially many more that have never been found. The lake's frigid depths and the absence of saltwater organisms that would otherwise degrade wooden hulls means that some wrecks have been found in extraordinary states of preservation, with intact rigging, personal belongings still in their cabins, and the faces of the crew members carved into the figurehead still recognizable after more than a century on the bottom. Fact 76. The earthquake that woke a nation. On April the 22nd, 1700, one of the most powerful earthquakes in the recorded history of North America occurred along the Cascadia subduction zone, a fault line that runs along the seafloor off the coast of what is now British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. The earthquake, estimated to have had a magnitude of approximately 9 on the Richter scale, generated a tsunami that crossed the Pacific Ocean and struck the coast of Japan with waves of 2 to 3 meters, damaging communities along Japan's Pacific coast. We know the precise date of the earthquake partly because Japanese officials recorded the arrival of the tsunami and the destruction it caused, providing a historical anchor for the geological evidence that accumulated on the North American side. The date was established by dendrochronology, the science of reading tree rings, by studying the ghost forests of drowned cedar trees visible at low tide along the Washington and Oregon coasts, trees that died when the land dropped into the sea during the earthquake. Fact 77. The fastest glacier. In the landscape of the Canadian Rockies and the Columbia Mountains of British Columbia, glaciers that have existed for thousands of years are retreating with a speed that geologists who have spent their careers studying these ice fields describe with the barely suppressed alarm of people watching something irreplaceable disappear before their eyes. The Columbia ice field, which sits astride the Continental Divide in Jasper National Park and is the largest ice field in the Rocky Mountains south of Alaska, feeds glaciers that flow in 6 directions, draining eventually into 3 different oceans, the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Arctic. The Athabasca Glacier, the most accessible of the Columbia ice field's outlets and the one that millions of tourists have visited over the decades, has retreated over 1.5 kilometers since the late 19th century and lost half its volume. Markers placed along the valley at the glacier's historic front show visitors the progression of retreat over the past century and a half, each marker standing a little further from the ice than the last, measuring out in visible physical distance the scale of what is being lost. Fact 78. The art that survived everything. In 1969, a series of hand-printed silkscreen posters began appearing in the windows of shops and community centers in Montreal. The images were simple and striking, depicting scenes of Quebec life, of workers and families and landscapes, in a style that drew on folk art traditions and the techniques of political poster art. The artist was an anonymous collective that eventually became known as Graph, and the work they produced helped spark a renaissance of printmaking and public art in Quebec that continues to this day. But the broader story of Canadian art, surviving hostile conditions, goes back much further, to the forced suppression of Indigenous artistic traditions that was embedded in the residential school system and the laws that for decades made it illegal for Indigenous peoples to hold their own ceremonies and to produce or sell certain kinds of ceremonial art. Fact 79. The Prime Minister who wore a rose. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who served as Prime Minister of Canada from 1968 to 1979 and again from 1980 to 1984, was one of the most intellectually formidable, stylistically distinctive, and politically divisive leaders in Canadian history. He arrived on the national political scene at a moment of enormous cultural ferment, the late 1960s, and his combination of intellectual rigor, personal charisma, and genuine unconventionality generated a response that journalists named Trudeau-mania, a level of celebrity enthusiasm for a political leader that Canada had never seen before and has not quite seen since. Trudeau wore fresh roses in his lapel, drove sports cars, pirouetted behind the backs of foreign royalty at state occasions, and married a woman 29 years younger than him, in a ceremony so secret that even his closest political advisors didn't know about it until after it happened. Fact 80. The Marathon of Hope. In the spring of 1980, a 21-year-old man with cancer in his right leg that had required its amputation above the knee ran out of St. John's, Newfoundland, dipped his prosthetic leg into the cold Atlantic water, and began to run. His name was Terry Fox, and he was attempting something that no one had ever done, a cross-Canada run to raise money for cancer research, running a marathon distance of 42 kilometers every single day. He called it the Marathon of Hope. What followed over the next 143 days was one of the most extraordinary individual athletic feats in the history of sport, and one of the most powerful stories in Canadian history. Fox ran through Newfoundland and Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, through Quebec, where he struggled against the language barrier and the indifference of crowds, and into Ontario, where the public attention to his run began to grow. By the time he reached Ontario, he was running through cheering crowds and meeting with public figures and raising money at a rate that astonished everyone, including Fox himself. He was forced to stop outside Thunder Bay on September 1st, 1980, when it was discovered that the cancer had spread to his lungs. Fact 81. The island that made a province. Prince Edward Island, the smallest province in Canada, floating in the Gulf of St. Lawrence between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, has an outsized place in Canadian history for a piece of land that is only 224 kilometers long and never more than 64 kilometers wide. It was here in Charlottetown in September 1864 that the conference took place that launched the process of Confederation, the meeting of colonial politicians from the various British North American colonies that set in motion the creation of the country. The Charlottetown Conference has been called the birthplace of Confederation, though the more substantial and contentious negotiations actually happened at subsequent conferences in Quebec City and London. PEI itself declined to join the country at Confederation in 1867, holding out for better terms and not joining until 1873. Fact 82. The winter that changed hockey. In the long and mythologized history of hockey in Canada, few moments are as celebrated or as contested as the creation story of the game itself. The standard narrative places the origins of organized hockey in Montreal in 1875, when a group of McGill University students played what is often described as the first organized indoor hockey game at the Victoria Skating Rink. But the history of hockey is more complicated and more interesting than a single founding moment. Evidence of ice games played with sticks and pucks or balls goes back decades earlier and can be found in multiple locations across Canada and in similar games played in Europe. The Mi'kmaq people of Nova Scotia had a stick and ball game on ice that some historians believe was an influence on the game that eventually became hockey. Windsor, Nova Scotia, has its own claim to be the birthplace of hockey. Various games played on the frozen surfaces of Kingston, Ontario, and other locations in the early 19th century have their advocates. Fact 83. The nurse who became a symbol. During the Second World War, a young woman from Lakeham, Alberta, named Elizabeth Smellie, was not fighting on the front lines, but was playing a role in the war effort that was no less essential. By that point in her career, Smellie had already become the first woman in Canadian history to be appointed a colonel in the Canadian Army, serving as matron-in-chief of the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps. But the story of Canadian nurses in both world wars is one of extraordinary courage and sacrifice that receives far less recognition than it deserves. Over 3,000 Canadian nurses served in the First World War, working in conditions of terrible danger, under shell fire, in flooded trenches, and improvised field hospitals, losing dozens of their number to enemy action, disease, and the inevitable consequences of working in the bloodiest conflict in human history. The sinking of the hospital ship Landovery Castle by a German U-boat in 1918 killed 14 Canadian nursing sisters, making them the largest single group of women to die in Canadian military service. Fact 84. The mountain pass that moved the world. In the summer of 1897, following the discovery of gold in the Klondike region of the Yukon the previous year, over 100,000 people began the journey north from Seattle and Vancouver toward the goldfields, and the great majority of them had to cross one of two mountain passes in the coast mountains of the Alaska Panhandle, the Chilkoot Pass, or the White Pass, to descend into the Yukon watershed and continue by boat to Dawson City. The Chilkoot Pass, at 3,526 feet, was a brutal climb that required stamina, determination, and either the money to hire indigenous packers or the willingness to make dozens of trips up the steep and often icy slope to carry one's outfit piece by piece. The Northwest Mounted Police, enforcing Canadian law at the top of the pass, required every person crossing into Canadian territory to carry at least a year's worth of supplies, a rule designed to prevent starvation in the wilderness, which meant that each stampeder had to haul roughly a ton of goods up the pass. Fact 85. The painting that shocked a country. In 1920, the Group of Seven held their first exhibition at the Art Gallery of Toronto and presented to the Canadian public a vision of the national landscape that many viewers found deeply disturbing. Critics, accustomed to the gentle pastoral conventions of European landscape painting, were confronted with images of stripped and contorted pine trees, of rock and ice, and stormlight rendered in colors so bold and form so angular that they seemed almost violent. One prominent critic described the work as a sort of art cult, based on the worship of ugliness. The painters, undeterred by this reception, pressed forward, making annual trips to the most remote and challenging landscapes of the Canadian Shield, the north shore of Lake Superior, Algonquin Park, Georgian Bay, and bringing back paintings that captured the particular quality of northern Canadian light and the specific character of the Shield landscape with a directness that no previous Canadian artist had attempted. Fact 86. The code that nobody broke. During the Second World War, the signals intelligence operation known as Station M, operated by the Canadian branch of the British Special Operations Executive from a facility in Montreal, developed a specialized expertise in forging documents that was virtually undetectable. The team produced fake passports, identity papers, ration books, official seals, and every kind of official documentation required by agents operating in occupied Europe, working with a precision and a knowledge of enemy bureaucratic procedures that made their forgeries indistinguishable from the originals. But the most significant Canadian contribution to wartime signals and intelligence operations was the work done by the Communications Security Establishment, Canada's Signals Intelligence Agency, which worked alongside its British counterpart GCHQ and the American NSA to intercept and analyze enemy communications. The examination unit, operating from a building in Ottawa, broke Japanese diplomatic codes, analyzed Vichy French traffic, and contributed to the Allied intelligence picture in ways whose full scope remained classified for decades after the war. Fact 87. The Northern Promise and its cost. The discovery of gold in the Klondike in 1896 was not the first nor the last time that Canada's north attracted waves of hopeful prospectors and adventurers seeking their fortune in the landscape. The broader pattern of northern resource exploitation from the fur trade of the 17th century through the gold rushes of the 19th and the oil sands development of the 20th follows a consistent arc of extraction, profit, and departure, in which the resources of the North are used to generate wealth that flows primarily south and east, while the communities and ecosystems of the North bear the costs. The communities of the Yukon and Northwest Territories and Nunavut have lived through multiple cycles of this boom and bust pattern, and their residents have developed a sophisticated and often ambivalent relationship with the resource industries that have periodically transformed their communities. Whitehorse, the capital of the Yukon, grew from a stampede service center into a small but vibrant city, sustained partly by government services and partly by a tourism industry built on the gold rush mythology and the natural beauty of the territory. Fact 88. The Whale Road of the Arctic. For thousands of years before the arrival of European ships in the Arctic, the Inuit peoples of the Canadian North had built a civilization ideally adapted to one of the harshest environments on Earth, one that depended fundamentally on their intimate knowledge of the sea ice and the animals that lived in and around it. The bowhead whale, the largest animal in the Arctic ecosystem, was central to Inuit culture and survival across the eastern and central Arctic. Bowhead whales can live for over 200 years, meaning that some of the whales swimming in Arctic waters today were alive when the first European whalers arrived in those same waters in the 17th century. The Inuit developed extraordinarily sophisticated techniques for hunting these massive animals from small boats made of wood and skin, using harpoons tipped with toggling heads designed to hold fast in the whale's blubber, attached to lines of sealskin that slowed and exhausted the animal. The cooperative social structures required for bowhead whale hunting shaped Inuit society profoundly, demanding high levels of coordination, skill, and trust among hunters. Fact 89. The city that grows upward and downward. The city of Vancouver, sitting at the southwestern corner of British Columbia, where the mountains meet the sea and the Fraser River Delta spreads into the Strait of Georgia, is one of the most beautiful urban settings in the world and one of the most expensive housing markets on Earth. The combination of extraordinary natural beauty, mild Pacific climate, thriving economy, and position as the primary Canadian gateway to the Asia-Pacific region has made Vancouver a destination for immigrants and investors from around the world, driving property values to levels that have made the city unaffordable for a growing portion of its own population. But the Vancouver that exists today, with its glass towers and harbor views, and Stanley Park, sits on land that was for millennia the home of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, nations whose archaeological presence in the lower Fraser Valley extends back at least 10,000 years. Fact 90. The radio signal from the edge of space. In the winter of 1962, a Canadian satellite called Alouette 1 was launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California aboard an American rocket, becoming the first satellite to be designed, built, and operated by a country other than the United States or the Soviet Union. The satellite's purpose was the scientific study of the ionosphere, the uppermost layer of Earth's atmosphere, and it was extraordinarily successful, operating for 10 years and returning data that transformed our understanding of the structure and behavior of the upper atmosphere. Alouette 1 was the product of the Defense Research Telecommunications Establishment in Ottawa, and its successful launch made Canada the third country in the world with a satellite program. What is perhaps most remarkable about Alouette 1 is how it was built, largely by hand by a small team of dedicated scientists and engineers working with relatively modest resources, producing a spacecraft that outperformed many of its contemporaries and demonstrated that Canada could play at the frontier of space technology. Fact 91. The language of the land. There are approximately 70 distinct Indigenous languages still spoken in Canada, belonging to 11 separate language families that are as different from each other as English is from Japanese. This linguistic diversity is itself evidence of the extraordinary depth and complexity of the Indigenous civilizations that developed in Canada over thousands of years, since languages diverge and develop separately only over very long periods of time in isolation from each other. Many of these languages are now critically endangered, with only a handful of elderly speakers remaining, the direct result of the residential school system and other policies specifically designed to eradicate Indigenous languages by removing children from their families and punishing them for speaking anything other than English or French. The loss of these languages is not merely a cultural tragedy, but an intellectual one, since each language represents a unique way of encoding knowledge about the world, including highly specific knowledge of local environments, medicinal plants, ecological relationships, and sustainable resource management practices that accumulated over millennia and that exist in no other form. Fact 92. The quiet giant of hockey. In the long history of the National Hockey League, which was founded in Montreal in 1917 and which grew from a small regional league into a major North American sport, over the course of the 20th century, there is no figure more dominant or more quietly extraordinary than the one they call the Great One. Wayne Gretzky, born in Brantford, Ontario in 1961, holds more NHL records than any other player in the history of the sport, and holds several records that are considered by statisticians to be essentially unbreakable. His career goal total of 894 is remarkable, but what makes the achievement almost incomprehensible is that his career assist total of 1,963 is also higher than any other player's total points, meaning that even if you removed all of Gretzky's goals from his record, he would still be the all-time points leader on assists alone. He was traded from the Edmonton Oilers to the Los Angeles Kings in 1988, in a deal that many Canadians experienced as a kind of national grief, the loss of the player who had, during his years with the Oilers, led the team to 4 Stanley Cup championships and had made the city of Edmonton briefly the center of the hockey world. Fact 93. The Invisible War that Shaped a Coast. Few episodes in Canadian history are as strange and as little known as the Japanese attack on the Canadian mainland during the Second World War. On June 20th, 1942, the Japanese submarine I-26 surfaced in the waters off the west coast of Vancouver Island and shelled the Estevan Point Lighthouse, a wireless station and lighthouse on the remote northwestern coast of Vancouver Island. The attack caused minimal damage and no casualties, but it had an outsized psychological impact, representing the only direct attack on a Canadian military installation on Canadian soil during the entire war. The Japanese also launched a program of incendiary balloon bombs, known as Fugo balloons, that were carried across the Pacific by the jet stream and were designed to start fires in North American forests. Several hundred of these balloons landed in Canada and the United States, most of them in British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest, with relatively little effect. One Japanese balloon bomb killed 6 people in rural Oregon in May 1945, the only direct casualties from enemy action on the North American continent during the Second World War. Fact 94. The boat that crossed alone. Among the many remarkable solo ocean crossings in maritime history, one that deserves more recognition than it receives is the voyage of John Voss, of Victoria, British Columbia. Ship captain, who in 1901 set out to circumnavigate the world in a dugout canoe he had purchased from the Haida First Nation. The canoe, which Voss named Telecum, was about 11 meters long and was modified with a small cabin and a set of sails, and in this improbable vessel Voss sailed across the Pacific Ocean, through the Torres Strait, across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, across the Atlantic, and finally reached England in 1904 after a voyage of over 65,000 kilometers that took more than 3 years. The journey was not without its tragedies, including the mysterious disappearance overboard of his first companion during the Pacific crossing, circumstances that were never fully explained and that hung over the rest of the voyage. Fact 95. The snow that never melts. High in the mountains of British Columbia and Alberta, and in the valleys and plateaus of the Yukon and Northwest Territories, there lie fields of ice and snow that have been accumulating for thousands of years, glaciers and ice fields that are the frozen memory of past climates, containing within their annual layers a record of atmospheric conditions going back millennia. Ice core samples drilled from these ancient glaciers carry trapped bubbles of ancient air that allow scientists to measure the composition of the atmosphere long before any human being thought to record it, providing a baseline against which current atmospheric changes can be measured. The results of these measurements have been among the most powerful pieces of evidence for the reality of human-caused climate change. The ice in these cores contains air from before the Industrial Revolution, before the burning of fossil fuels began adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere at rates the planet had not seen for millions of years, and the difference between that ancient air and the air we breathe today is recorded in every glacier and ice field in the world. Fact 96. The maple and what it means. Canada's relationship with the maple tree goes deeper than a flag design or a pancake syrup, though those are real enough. The maple, particularly the sugar maple, Acer saccharum, which grows across eastern Canada in a belt stretching from Manitoba through Ontario and Quebec and into the Maritime provinces, was a resource of enormous importance to the Indigenous peoples of eastern Canada long before any Europeans set foot on the continent. The Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee and Algonquin peoples had developed sophisticated methods for collecting maple sap and concentrating it into syrup and sugar, using the bark of birch trees as collection vessels and heating the sap with fire-heated stones to evaporate the water. Early European settlers, desperately seeking a source of sweetening in a land without sugarcane, adopted and refined these techniques, and maple sugar became a significant trade commodity in the colonial economy of New France. Today, Quebec produces roughly 70% of the world's maple syrup, making it one of the most dominant producers of any single food product in the world. Fact 97. The frozen Thames of the North. In the long winter of 1870 to 1871, a diplomatic event of extraordinary importance and extraordinary drama took place across the frozen landscape of the Canadian West. Louis Riel's Red River resistance had ended with the creation of Manitoba, but Riel himself had been forced to flee into the United States, and the new province was under the nominal authority of a federal government that had sent troops west to assert its control. In this volatile context, an American filibuster named William O'Donoghue attempted to raise a force in Minnesota and invade the new province of Manitoba, hoping to annex it to the United States. The invasion force was tiny, and its attempt was pathetic in its military ambition, but the incident galvanized Canadian concerns about American expansionism and reminded everyone involved just how precarious Canada's hold on the Prairie West really was. Fact 98. The bridge that collapsed 3 times. In the annals of engineering disasters in Canadian history, few episodes are as haunting or as instructive as the story of the Quebec Bridge, which failed catastrophically, not once but twice during its construction in the early 20th century, killing a total of 88 workers and remaining the deadliest bridge construction disaster in history. The Quebec Bridge was designed to cross the St. Lawrence River just south of Quebec City, and when completed, would be the longest cantilever bridge span in the world. Construction began in 1900, but the engineering calculations were flawed from the beginning. On the afternoon of August 29, 1907, as workers were preparing to leave for the day, the partially completed south cantilever arm began to buckle under the stress of its own weight and collapsed into the river, killing 75 workers in seconds. Fact 99. The country that is still becoming. Canada, in the end, is not a finished thing. It is a country whose borders were drawn and redrawn over centuries of negotiation, conflict, and compromise, whose constitution is still contested, whose relationships between its peoples are still being worked out, and whose full story has not yet been written. It is a country large enough to hold almost every kind of landscape and almost every kind of human experience, where you can stand in an ancient redwood forest on the Pacific coast and be 10 time zones away from the fishing villages of Newfoundland, where northern lights dance over communities where the same families have lived for 1,000 years, and where cities that did not exist 50 years ago now house millions of people from every corner of the earth. It is a country that has done terrible things, broken promises to its indigenous peoples, turned away refugees, interned its own citizens, and which is still coming to terms with those histories in ways that are painful and necessary and incomplete. And there you have it, 99 remarkable pieces of Canadian history, each one a window into a world more layered and more surprising than any textbook ever quite managed to show. From ancient glaciers to hidden tunnels, from vanished ships to the births of sciences that changed humanity, Canada's story stretches far and deep. If you found yourself drifting peacefully through these facts tonight, consider subscribing for more gentle journeys through the extraordinary past. Sleep well wherever in the world you are.